In the last weeks, I've spent a lot of time explaining fundamental concepts of Kubernetes. But from today on, all these puzzle pieces are slowly coming together and we're getting closer to working on real projects. The central part that was still missing is Ingress in Kubernetes. So in this video, I will show you how to control traffic to your pods in Kubernetes, create reverse proxies, and manage SSL certificates. We will deploy Traefik by using Helm, and then we will use it to expose an Nginx web server with trusted SSL certificates on my Kubernetes cluster. And because you might need a Kubernetes cluster to follow this tutorial along, which service could be better than the sponsor of this video, Civo? Civo is a cloud-native service provider and makes it extremely easy to spin up your own Kubernetes cluster in just about 90 seconds. Civo offers you flexible and fair pricing for Kubernetes, Linux machines and storage, which you can easily manage through their web interface, an API, a CLI and other automation tools. They also have excellent support and a very supportive community, so if you want to use and try out Civo, then just use their free credits when you sign up. That gives you enough time to check it out, and you will find a link to that in the description of this video. So if you have your Kubernetes cluster up and running and you start deploying some services on it, you might want to expose them to the public internet. And in the past, we've used service objects in Kubernetes to make our application available with a load balancer. But that's just exposing the application on our pods directly. And you often have this situation that applications don't offer an HTTPS service, for example, or you want to run multiple applications on the same pod and route them based on subdomains. So what we will do instead of creating separate load balancer services for our pods is we will use a reverse proxy in between, and that can accept all the traffic on a given entry point like HTTP and HTTPS, and then forwards this traffic based on the rules and policies to our service objects and pods within the Kubernetes cluster. In Kubernetes, you can then manage the reverse proxies and traffic routes with ingress objects. An ingress object defines how a service is accessed from outside the cluster. So with that, we can make more granular decisions about the traffic, modify header information, or expose even unencrypted services with trusted SSL certs. To make these ingress rules work, we will also need to deploy an ingress controller. So this is our main reverse proxy that accepts the traffic and forwards it based on the ingress routes. And Kubernetes is, as always, very flexible about what the ingress controller can be. So you can use Nginx as your ingress controller, you can use Traefik, and also other ones as well. So on the Kubernetes documentation, you can find a list with all common reverse proxies which can work as an ingress controller, depending on your cluster needs. And that can make it sometimes a little bit confusing because you will find many different tutorials which will all teach you different things. So I just like to use Traefik as my standard ingress controller in Kubernetes and in Docker. But just know there are many other possibilities to configure and use ingress in Kubernetes as well. So I just show you my approach, which has worked for me pretty well in most scenarios that I've tested. Okay, so let's start deploying Traefik on my Kubernetes cluster and use it as a default ingress controller. So just to let you know, we're using a bunch of different tools and techniques in this video that you actually should be familiar with, such as the Traefik reverse proxy, the Helm package manager, or reverse proxies and trusted SSL certs in general. So just in case you're wondering, what the hell is this guy talking about? Then I've done separate videos, one about Traefik setting up on Docker, one about the Helm package manager, and I've done many videos on reverse proxies. So I will link you those videos and tutorials in the description down below, so just in case you have any questions. But I try to explain as much as I can in this video, so just follow it and try to see if that works for you. So the first thing we need to do is we need to install Traefik with the Helm package manager on our Kubernetes cluster. And the first thing that is very important is that you're always using the correct Helm chart with the latest Traefik version, because I've seen that on some cloud providers when you use their one-click marketplace solutions to just install Traefik with one simple click. They are not always using the latest version of Traefik, and because Traefik has changed in many configuration settings from version 1 to version 2, which are not backwards compatible, yeah, this is also sometimes not working when you follow this tutorial. So make sure when you go to the Artifact Hub and download your Traefik repository, you're always using the latest version of the organization Traefik Labs and use this repository here. This is very important. Of course, you also need to inject some of the configuration settings via the values file inside the Helm chart. So you can obtain those default values in the artifact tab and see all the different configuration settings that you can apply to your Helm installation. But I also try to make it a little bit simpler for you and follow this tutorial better, because I've added another template file on my boilerplates repository on GitHub. You will also find that in the description. So just go to GitHub, to my boilerplates repository, and then just go to the Kubernetes directory, go to Traefik, and inside this directory you will find a values file that you can use as a template. So just copy this, and let's create a new project folder and create a Traefik-values.yaml file, for example, and paste it here. What you configure here, that now depends on your setup. So I will just show you one example with the DNS challenge on Cloudflare, because this is my DNS provider that I'm using. But in case you're using a different DNS provider, you can check out configurations for this on the Traefik documentation, or you can just use a generic HTTP challenge that will just try to make a DNS request to the domain you want to obtain the certificate for and try to get an HTTP connection working there. And in case you're wondering, what are the different configurations if you want to customize those certificate resolvers, on the Traefik documentation page, you can find how this works. So one thing that is very important on Traefik configuration, Traefik has many different ways of configuring it, and this sometimes makes it very confusing. I've seen tutorial videos, they use a YAML file. I've seen other tutorials that use a TOML file. And I think on Kubernetes, it's the best way to use the CLI commands to inject those configuration values and put them in the additional argument section of your Helm chart, and this is really making it easier. So to configure my certificate resolvers, I'm always using these CLI commands here, and you can see there are also some examples how to do that. If you're using a different DNS provider or you want to use a DNS challenge, it's also described in the documentation. You can also find all the different settings for the DNS providers like Cloudflare, like DigitalOcean, or whatever DNS provider you're using. So on Cloudflare, it's actually very easy, because on Cloudflare, we just need to obtain two environment variables here. So one for the API email, one for the API key, or you're using an API token. That depends on what you want to use. So in this configuration of Traefik, let's first of all set our certificate resolver here. So we don't need this HTTP challenge. So let's try to uncomment these lines here. And now it's very important that when you configure a certificate resolver on Traefik, you would need to give it a name, like Cloudflare, for example, and then use the challenge setting. So in my case, I want to use a DNS challenge. The provider will be set to Cloudflare. And then we also need to inject my email address here. So I want to use creative.de. And the DNS challenge resolver 1.1.1.1 is the DNS server of Cloudflare. And then we also want to store those certificates inside a folder which is called ssl-certs acme-cloudflare.json. This is a file where I store the certificates, and this should point to a persistent volume. And now we want to also inject the authentication for the DNS challenge, because the DNS challenge will always need some kind of authentication so that you can prove that you have an ownership of the domain you want to obtain the certificate for. So in the environment variable section, we now can define our environment variables, and you can see the Cloudflare example is using CF API email, CF API key, just according to the official documentation like this one here. You can change it with the other values of your DNS provider if you want to customize it. So let's just go to the configuration and uncomment the Cloudflare example here. So, and what's also important is that you could pass the environment variables in clear text here in your Helm chart values, but this is not the preferred way how I'm doing it, because I want to store it in a secret object in Kubernetes. So let's first of all create this object and call it Cloudflare credentials.yaml. And inside this file, we want to configure a secret object, version 1. The kind is a secret. And the metadata should be Cloudflare credentials. And the namespace, we want to change from kubesystem to Traefik. So just use the same namespace where you are deploying Traefik later. And now we want to inject a string data. The first one is the email address. This will be my stcreative.de, and then we want to inject the API key. So just in case you're wondering where to find those API token settings on Cloudflare, you can just go to your personal profile, then you can see your email address here and go to API tokens. You can create another DNS token here, but the settings that I'm using are the API keys, so I'm just using the global API key. View this and use it in my credentials. So let's apply this file Cloudflare credentials. So the next section is some log information. I've added this because if you run into some trouble, this is not working for some reason, you can change the log level to debug and then just follow the log files once the pod is running, and then you can see what is going wrong. It will give you some more details about what Traefik is doing in the background, but the default log level error should be still fine. And now we can configure our entry points here. So it is important to understand that Traefik uses two ports here. So the port 80 for HTTP connections and port 443 for HTTPS connections. And it always names it with entry points. And you could also add custom entry points. If you want to expose the port 9000, for example, for Portainer, you can add another entry point here, which is called Portainer, and set the port to 9000 and so on. But for most cases, you actually just need those two entry points, the web for HTTP and web secure for HTTPS. And what is also now working in the latest version of Traefik, you can add a permanent redirect from HTTP connections to HTTPS. So in the past, you would need to add those complicated entries and configuration settings somewhere in the Ingress controller. So now you can also add just or enable this argument, redirect to web secure, and then you will always forward all HTTP connections to the HTTPS counterpart. So this is very useful for security, so you definitely should go with this setting. And then in the web secure entry point, you also should enable TLS and set a default certificate resolver. So this is very important to understand because there are different ways of configuring the certificate resolver for your Ingress objects, and this can be configured per Ingress object with annotations. I will show you that later. It's a little bit, sometimes confusing. That's why I added this heading here, because if you configure a default certificate resolver for the web secure entry point, and then Traefik will always try to use this certificate resolver whenever a connection is exposed with HTTPS, which should be always the case, and then it tries to obtain a trusted SSL certificate for that particular domain you will configure in the Ingress object later. So this is very, very comfortable. With this way, you can just automatically obtain SSL certificates for every application you're exposing with Ingress. So the next configuration setting is to disable the dashboard, because we don't want a default Ingress route to this dashboard because there's no authentication, there's no security. And the next setting will be the persistent storage for all certificates. So this is very important because otherwise, whenever you're restarting Traefik, and you're not persistently storing the SSL certificate, Traefik will always need to obtain this certificate every time you're restarting the service. So that is not needed if you enable persistence and configure the path SSL certs as a persistent volume, which should match the location where you're storing the certificates here. And what I also needed to do is I needed to add a section in the deployment init containers that will change the default permissions of the persistent volume. And last but not least, we will set Traefik as my default Ingress controller according to Kubernetes 1.19 onwards changes. So this is also another setting I need to explain, because you can see it can get complex with Traefik and reverse proxies on Kubernetes. This is why I've worked so hard on this project to make this work. But the Ingress class is something that is new in Kubernetes 1.19. You can read about this in the official documentation of Kubernetes. You can see the Ingress classes can be implemented by different controllers, often with different configurations. So you could also add multiple Ingress controllers on your Kubernetes cluster, and then you somehow need to configure which Ingress controller do you want to use for this Ingress objects. And in the past, you needed to configure this in the Ingress objects with annotations. This is why in some outdated tutorials, you will still see some annotations that will set the Ingress object to Traefik. This is not needed when you create the Ingress class in the first place and then configure it as your default Ingress controller, because with this heading, you don't need any annotations in ingress controllers anymore, because it will always use Traefik as your ingress controller, and it will always try to obtain a trusted SSL cert from the resolver. So with these configuration settings, I could completely get rid of any annotations in the ingress object, which makes it very, very comfortable. So this is my configuration, and it works for me very, very well. But just to let you know, it might not work for you because you're using a different DNS provider, you're using a different challenge to obtain the certificates or whatever. So in case you have any questions, just join to the Discord and just refer to the documentation, obviously, and use my templates. It will hopefully help you. Okay, so we now have created our secret object, we have created our values file, we now can install Traefik. And first of all, make sure that you have created a namespace that is called Traefik. So in case you haven't done this, just create ns Traefik, and then switch your configuration in the current namespace. So I'm doing this with an alias command, which will use the Traefik namespace. You can also see if I'm applying any Helm charts or Kubernetes objects, it will tell us this in the ZSH extension that I've done. By the way, I've also done a separate video on my ZSH terminal setup. You can check it out in the description. That is very, very helpful for Kubernetes. Okay, so now we have done the repo update. We now want to install the Traefik Helm chart with the project name Traefik. So let's use the Traefik Helm chart. And we also want to use the values file, which is called traefik-values.yaml. And let's hit enter and see if it works. So this is now deployed. Let's try to get everything in the current namespace and see if it's running. You can see that Traefik is still pending because it probably creates a persistent volume for the certificates in the background. We also already have a load balancer object which has an external IP address. So now it's very important that you choose this external IP address of your load balancer object, copy this, and on your DNS server where you have set up your domain name, then use this as a target. So otherwise, when you're trying to obtain certificates or you're forwarding any subdomains to services, this wouldn't work. So I've created an A record for the wildcard that is using every subdomain of sealedcreative.de, forward this to the load balancer object and also the name sealedcreative.de. So every connection for every subdomain of this should be connected to my load balancer object. So now let's check if the services are running. You can see everything is fine. In case something is going wrong, you're wondering, so what the hell is not working? You can always check the events. So with kube ctl get events, you can also see what's going on. You can see some log files of the Kubernetes provisioner, but you can also check the log files of the pod. So for example, when we get the pod Traefik, this is a correct pod. You can also enter k logs and then the name of your pod, and you can see everything worked fine. The configuration loaded from Flex. This is now perfectly working. We can now start using the Traefik reverse proxy. Okay, so now that we have deployed our Ingress controller, we have prepared everything, we can now use it to expose any applications. And I will show you how easily it is to just expose an Nginx web server with trusted SSL certificates and Ingress objects. So let's go into this project folder and let's create some new objects we want to expose. So let's, for example, create another object, which is called Ingress, not Ingress, Nginx deployment.yaml. And I will just go back to my boilerplates repository because I'm also sharing some general templates for Kubernetes here. So in the templates folder, you can also see a deployment template, for example. So let's just use this here, copy it, and let's add this here. So I will make some changes to this deployment because the app name, that should be Nginx. And the namespace should be, let's create a new namespace for this. So let's create a new namespace, Nginx test, for example. And let's use this namespace, Nginx test, for our deployment. The Traefik selector will be set to Nginx. The replicas are 1. This is perfectly fine. And now in the specifications, we obviously won't use this hello world container. We want to use an Nginx container here. And we don't need any resources. We want to expose a container port. So this is important to set this to port 80. And volumes, we don't need persistent volumes for now. So let's just go with this simple deployment here. But we also want to add a service object because we need to expose this Nginx deployment with a cluster IP. Because this is where Traefik reverse proxy can connect to internally of the cluster. So we have the kind deployment. Let's also add a service object to this file. So let's go back to my boilerplates and let's go to a service. And let's copy the service template with cluster IP, for example, and paste it here. So there's a new service object. I want to uncomment the service type object cluster IP. We don't need this here. The service name will be just Nginx. Just use the same service name. The namespace will be nginx-test, and the Traefik selector will be the app name, which is also Nginx. So you can see I'm making it simple here. And the cluster IP will be port 80. So let's just use port 80. That will be fine. Okay, so this deployment will now create a new container, Nginx, and will expose it internally in the cluster on port 80. So let's go with this deployment and apply it. Okay, so if we now get our resources, let's also switch into Nginx test as my default namespace, and let's get all. And you should see there are two objects here. We have one deployment and a service object, cluster IP. We don't have any external IP address, so no one can actually access this. We now want to create an Ingress object that will connect to Traefik and just expose this Nginx server on a specific subdomain. For example, let's just use nginx-test.clcreative.de. We want to expose this application with trusted SSL certs on this subdomain. So now we want to create an Ingress object that will define the route for Traefik. So Traefik knows where to route the traffic to. Okay, so let's do that. We can actually find this in the same deployment file. We don't need to separate this. So let's create a new Ingress object. And you also find a template for an Ingress object in the boilerplates repository. You can find it here, but I also created in the Traefik folder a template folder where you can where you will find separate templates for the Traefik reverse proxy here in Ingress object, for example. So let's copy this and just paste it in my deployment here. So you can see the Ingress objects. Let's get quickly through the Ingress object. It will use a different API version, which is called networking k8s.io version 1 from the kind Ingress. And now we want to set the name to Nginx, and the namespace will be Nginx test. So now we can also add some optional annotations here. So the annotations can configure certain aspects of Traefik. So you can see, for example, when you add an annotation, Traefik.ingress.kubernetes, and then add like a router middleware, you can inject middlewares into this Ingress objects. So we are not covering middlewares here because it obviously would be much more complex for this video. This would be too much. Now what we need to do is we need to set up our hostname. So now we need to specify our rules here. And we want to create a new rule for a specific hostname, which will be nginx-test.clcreative.de, for example. So this route will only listen on that host name. And now we need to set up our paths. So the paths are important. You can set up routes for different paths. The prefix object will route every path that starts with that, but anything behind this path will be also matched for this. So for example, when you just add this route path with prefix, this stands for everything, right? So every path on this domain will be routed to this backend here. And in the backend, you can define a service object and then the port number of the service internally. So this port number here. So let's update this deployment. And that should create a new object, which is called Ingress. So when we get all resources, you shouldn't see those Ingress objects because they are not listed here. But when you get Ingress, you can see this Ingress object and you could also edit it. We now should be able to open the Nginx test.clcreative.de. So let's... so now it's working. Okay, so you can see... this is our Nginx server that we have just created, and you can see it's using an HTTPS connection. and we don't get a certificate warning. We have obtained a trusted SSL certificate, or Traefik has done that automatically. So now we could deploy any kind of application with an Ingress object. Okay, so I hope this video helped you to understand Ingress in Kubernetes and how to use Traefik as your Ingress controller. I think we covered most of the essential topics in Kubernetes which you should know. Of course, Kubernetes is much bigger. There are endless topics where I could make all videos about. But instead of making a tutorial for every single section and aspects of Kubernetes, I think it might be more interesting to make some videos about projects and things where I will use Kubernetes for to deploy my personal website or to run some services and my home lab and just experiment with it. So expect more project-based tutorials about Kubernetes in the future, but if there's anything you would like to see a tutorial video about, then just let me know in the comments. And as always, thanks everybody for watching. I'll catch you in the next one. Bye bye.